How many people?
Who cares? That's not the point. We're talking about the trend line. Who cares about the amount of people?
You're talking about all these.
You're trying to reframe it. No, it's not abstract.
Answer.
You're trying to reframe it because the numbers are bad. That's as simple as it gets. Donald Trump's numbers were dog
going
shit.
Down.
These were bad numbers.
Going down by half is a bad thing. How?
Welcome, everybody, to the newest episode of United Debates of America with me, Zach Kimball, and my buddy here, James Fishback. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. That's great.
That's good to hear. You've had quite a week, maybe even longer than a week. So you have been the epicenter of MAGA love for the past, what is it, like 7 days, 8 days? It's been a whirlwind for you, I'm sure.
It's been a couple interesting weeks, and it isn't even just MAGA love. I mean, certainly parts of the Republican Party like it. A lot of parts don't. Speaker Johnson has pushed back. And just for full background, we're talking about this DOGE Dividend proposal that our team put together here at Azoria, the investment firm that I run. But I got to tell you, it's gotten a lot of interest from people who aren't even political, Zach, who have sent their tax dollars to DC for too long, haven't really seen what the benefits of those tax dollars have done for them. And then this idea, which we laid out just very simply, is whatever amount of money DOGE saves, government efficiency, whether it's coming from the executive side with President Trump and Elon, or coming from Congress with the Senate DOGE caucus, et cetera, whatever that amount of money is over the next couple of years, take 20% of that and send it right back to the hardworking Americans who sent it to DC in the first place. And the number that has been out there that we put in our own proposal, and I encourage everyone to read it for themselves at mydogedividend.com, is a $5,000 check. The way we get there is $2 trillion of total savings, 20% of which is $400 billion. There are 80 million tax-paying households across America, so $400 billion divided by 80 million gets you the $5,000 check. But again, it's not necessarily the entire project proposal isn't predicated on hitting 2 trillion.
Right.
Zach, if you hit 1 trillion, the check goes to 2,500. If you only get 500 billion, the check is 1,250. Now, someone like you who's a little bit more pessimistic on what DOGE and government efficiency can accomplish, I think you still got to agree it's going to be more, maybe it's more than zero, less than 2 trillion. Whatever it is, whatever money is saved, our thinking is that it has to go back to the people who sent it to DC in the first place. One, as restitution. If there's a private contract in the private sector where one party agrees to do something and the other party agrees to pay, the party that agrees to do that thing, i.e. provide infrastructure, fund healthcare, education, whatever the case may be, doesn't do those things, and it turns out spends that money doing other things. Egregious examples of which I highlighted on CNN with my conversation with Michael Smerconish, sending $20 million to Iraq one year for Sesame Street, etc., a transgender opera in Colombia, a DEI musical in Ireland, while at the same time our roads, our bridges in the heartland are crumbling. 80% of fourth graders are not reading at grade level. That's a big problem. So the DOGE dividend says restitution is in order. And the second piece, and I'll end on this so we can talk about it, is incentive. How do we give the public incentive? Now, the incentive goes two ways, Zach. The first of which is that spending cuts are not generally popular. They're not. Even if they're good policy. In Eastern Europe, Greece has seen this time and again, that the second they try to rein in the spending, everybody comes out and there's a full-blown insurrection. So the part of it, too, is giving the average American an incentive to stick with the right path, which is fiscal responsibility. The second is giving the average American the incentive to tell the government, to hold the government accountable. We think money is being wasted here. We think money is being abused here. And therefore, we are holding you accountable. Why? Because the more that DOGE saves, the greater their DOGE dividend check is. And so much like Zach, there is a national debt clock. Our hope with the DOGE dividend check is there is a total DOGE savings clock divided by those number of households adjusted for that 20% cut. And so Americans, whether they're in East Baltimore or East Palestine, are following along saying, you know what? I'm glad that individual called out FEMA or HUD or the VA for abusing tax dollars. Now the total DOGE amount is up and our total DOGE dividend is up. And it's definitely a bold policy, but at the heart of it is trying to restore trust between the taxpayer and her government. Certainly gone really viral. I had a chance to speak with Elon last week and have been in touch with many in the administration. some really, really good conversations, most of which I want to keep private for now.
Sure. Yeah.
But it has been a very interesting couple of weeks, and I know that you've been following along
I
intently
have.
and have been sharing your feedback and making videos of your own, and
Absolutely.
it's been fun.
I think so. My response to all this is going to be a mixture of clarifying questions and then just kind of some challenging on the details. But I want to start with, you know what? Actually, I don't even want to start there. I'll start with on the surface. I think the general idea is a good idea, right? I don't agree with the levers in which they're being pulled and who is pulling those levers at DOGE. I don't think that they're doing the right thing by what they're focusing on with, federal layoffs. It's really such a tiny percentage of the budget. They're really starting in the wrong place in my mind. And I don't think that Elon Musk is in any position to be the one calling those shots because of his massive conflicts of interest. However, I think the general gist of DOGE is correct. I think trying to identify waste in this government is a smart thing to do. There's unquestionably waste. I think unquestionably there are small amounts of fraud. I haven't seen anything super systemic. I mean, there's definitely, when you look at the big number, you compare it to the budget, it's really not that big. But I think waste is definitely something that's happening. How we define waste is obviously going to be party specific. But generally, I like the idea. I think it's a smart idea. I think DOGE dividends, I get a little more concerned just in the fact that we're on pace to being almost around $1 trillion a year in our interest payments for our debt. And I personally, it's not, look, I would rather use that money not to send it back to people, but to send it into paying down our debt. But I know a portion of these savings would be allocated to that. So
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
It's not ignoring that. I'm not ignoring that fact. I do recognize that. But I think what I want to start with are some clarifying questions because there's a number. It's a complicated it's a complicated proposal, and I think a lot of people on the right, especially, got very excited about it, are misinterpreting some of the details. So I want to try to clear it up, get some straight answers on what it would mean. So I want to start with the big thing is everybody says, not everybody, but a lot of the folks on the right, especially on TikTok, are going, every man, woman, and child in the country is going to get a check for $5,000. We both know that's not accurate.
It's not accurate, and
right.
I've pushed back on that, and it's not in the proposal. Again, read the whole thing. I know you
Correct.
have, Zach, but
I have.
For anybody, they can go to mydogedividend.com. It's a 4-page proposal, and no, what it calls for is a $5,000 check per tax-paying household.
So that's where I want to ask a question next. When we define a tax-paying household, are we defining only people who have actually owed taxes at the end of the year? So, for example, I've seen some people where I'm not sure if they're correct or not. So I want you to correct the record on this. One of the statements was if you, in fact, got a tax return last year, you would not be eligible for this. Is that accurate or not?
Sorry, say that again.
So if you received a tax return, you received a tax refund. Sorry, if you received a tax refund, would you not be eligible for a DOGE dividend check?
That would have no impact on your eligibility.
So I'm literally just clarifying what I deem as potentially misinformation. Okay, great. So the eligibility is essentially if you're a net income tax paying family, correct? Is that the baseline?
Correct. Yeah. If you pay federal income tax, if you've paid federal income tax, which is to say that you are working, you are contributing to the system, then you would be entitled to that portion of what DOGE is. That may be 5,000, that may be 3,000, whatever that number is. It's not preordained. It's not predestined. In fact, I think that number is going to be a heck of a lot bigger, Zach, if we do the DOGE dividend, because everyday Americans are now going to feel part of the process. They're going to feel input. They're going to have skin in the game. And I'll tell you, there's nothing necessarily partisan about this proposal. Actually, nothing partisan at all, right? The idea of sending tax dollars back is a good idea, but to your point, you do not get it for not having contributed to the system, right?
So there's a question though, is it just predicated on income tax? So payroll tax, or do payroll taxes count? So if you are somebody who makes under $40,000 a year, say, and you probably have an effective tax rate of 0, but you paid payroll taxes like Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, do you not qualify?
So first off, I don't know the answer to that question. So our proposal is on net tax-paying households. I met with members of the Senate this past week, and members of the House. It's ultimately going to be the president's decision what the total eligibility looks like.
But for your personal proposal,
our personal proposal, as we typed it up, it was net taxpayers. Right.
So income tax or payroll and income tax?
No, it would be federal income tax.
Okay, so
you had to have paid federal income tax.
Got it.
And the reason why is that gives you the claim for which you're receiving restitution.
Sure. No, it's not a
right?
criticism. It's just a clarification.
It's just a clarification, right? It's just a clarification, right? So you don't get restitution for something you didn't pay into. I don't get to walk into Chipotle and say, I want a refund. And like, wait, did you buy a Chipotle? Did you buy a burrito? Like, no, I didn't. I just want a refund, right? I mean, this is predicated on you having paid into the system.
But so,
can I
push
sympathy
back
for,
on that though? Because it's payroll taxes are very expensive for people. It's not like if they don't pay income.
Oh, I
tax,
agree, but they're not by definition going to fund the transgender opera in Colombia or the Iraqi Sesame Street, right? Those are funding.
So you're only
Social
trying to essentially refund people for what you perceive as government waste spending. Is that an accurate description of
That's
it?
correct.
Okay, that's
That's what DOGE ends up delivering in savings, right? And by the way, I don't purport to be the final person who has say on this. I'm going to defer to President Trump on what that is. But as the proposal is typed right now, it is for those folks. I think there's a world in which anybody who files a federal income tax return, and that goes up into this year too, so it's not too late, right? So our proposal is also one of the benefits that we tout, Zach, is an increase in labor force participation. There are 7 million working age men in America who are not working. If there is the prospect of a check next summer with their name on it, simply by rejoining the labor force, also further incentivized by no tax on tips, no tax on overtime policies that I understand that you support, that were also supported by Vice President Harris. Good plagiarizing on her part, that at the end of the day, that would incentivize on the margins folks who are on the fence to come into the labor force because their all-in compensation is going to increase. And so it's not like it's too late, but again, I do want to leave the final details. I want to be respectful of the process that the president's ultimately going to have the final say.
Of course. No, I'm really just honestly opening up with clarification because there's so many details I think people have misinterpreted. And frankly, even I've just listened to a bunch of commentary on it and going, I don't know if this is true or not. So I can actually ask you directly what the intention was. I agree, whatever Trump ends up deciding to do, it's up to him. But so, okay. That all makes sense. What I want to get to next in terms of clarification is what the cuts are, what in your mind you think the cuts should be focused on. Because $2 trillion is a massive amount of cuts. So for the first question I have at $2 trillion is this over a 10-year period or next year's budget drops from 6.75 to 4.75 is in spending? Is that, which one is it?
It is neither. It is the total savings that DOGE accomplishes.
No, I understand
over whatever. Right, over whatever time period, right? So, for example, if DOGE is able to save, and it's an interesting point, right? Because if DOGE is able to save, let's call it $500 billion out of this year's budget, just as an example. Presume you're going to presume it's not going to carry over to next year. That is going to carry over to next year. So those savings would be compounded. So now that's $1 trillion in total savings. If you take that out to 5 years. So again, we're going to ultimately defer to some third party determine, perhaps the Congressional Budget Office, to determine what that compounding effect is going to be. But it's definitely possible, right? I mean, look.
Well, that's the question. It's like, what are the cuts that you guys are envisioning making? Because I think there's not a lot of room.
You got to go to defense. You got to go to defense.
I agree
Zach.
with you there. That's
you got to. You and I and Bernie, and Ro Khanna, we agree on that. You got to go to defense. And now, by the way, it's very helpful that Donald Trump is the president of peace. Okay, that's what he's. But
he's not doing a very good job with that so far.
Well, he invited Zelensky, and that's a longer conversation to have. He invited President Zelensky to sign a mineral rights deal. President Zelensky wanted to be too cute, wanted to litigate in front of the press, wanted to disrespect the president and the American people.
Completely disagree with that. That's wrong.
But again, the president of peace is in the. I'll tell you this:
He's president of peace. That's ridiculous.
The president who is predisposed to peace is in the best position possible. When's the last time you heard a Republican president say, "We got to take control of defense spending"?
I think that's great. I mean, that's great. Can get on board with.
George Bush never said that. George Bush never said that.
No, that
father
was not
or son never said that. And so what President Trump brings is he brings the honest focus that we don't have to compromise our standing, our own security by cutting defense. We're cutting defense in the places where there is bloat, where there is bureaucracy, where we are not compromising our ability to defend ourselves. If you do that, if you can cut 8 to 10% from defense and you compound that over a decade, that is absolutely massive. And so I agree with you. It's not. I mean, look, the $20-30 billion from USAID, that's real money. Make no mistake. We spend that money at the Department of Education every year. That's real money. But Zach, the real oomph is going to come by rolling up our sleeves, looking at defense, looking at improper payments in Social Security, improper payments in Medicare and Medicaid.
Right.
Anybody who's legitimately on those programs, of course, as President Trump has said, we're not touching that. But we've had $2 trillion of improper payments since 2003. That's bad. We need to get to the bottom of that. And so that's what we'll do.
So that's a
You're
20-something plus year period. I just look at it and I go, all this on paper, like when you look at what you're saying, theoretically it sounds nice, but then you start to dig into the data and you go, well, still doesn't add up. So for example, just to use what you just said, the defense budget's like $800 and something billion a year. It's 870 something billion a year. So 10% of that is just $80 billion. It's not a huge savings. So you have to cut to get to your even a trillion. It's 8% there, right? So you still have 92% left to cut. The recommendations that have been put out there, for example, trying to get the House Energy and Commerce Committee to cut $880 billion, which is for people who don't know, they're the people who oversee Medicare and Medicaid. That is an alarming statement because, yes, it's not saying, hey, directly, we're going to cut this money from Medicare and Medicaid, but there is not $880 billion worth of waste in those programs. I mean, even when you look at Social Security, which is a totally different bucket, but you talk about the waste and fraud there. The last Inspector General's report with Social Security found that only 2% of the payments that went out were fraudulent. So it's a small number. When you put these all together, it's like a big issue.
Well, the $880 billion number for Medicaid, that's a 10-year number, Zach.
No, I know, but even $80 billion cutting in Medicaid, people are going to lose their coverage.
Zach, it's $80 billion here and then it's $40 billion there.
But let's put it into a real context, right? When people look at the analysis of what that would mean, it means that up to 20 million people will lose their coverage. That's a shit ton of people. That's like a lot.
Well, hold on. But let's get nuance. Able-bodied men who are 30 years old, who are on the couch, need to pull themselves up, get a job, and stop depending on the federal.
But that's not 20
government.
million people. That's only 7 from your own accounting. So the other 13 million are still getting kicked off their insurance in this case. This is what I'm saying, is that like, as much as it's nice to say, hey, I'm going to cut you a check for whatever amount it ends up being, I don't think most people would exchange a $1,000 to $2,000 check for their health insurance. That's those. But that's what you're going to be forced to do.
But so there's a lot of different moving pieces here. Let's just start the biggest picture possible.
Yeah.
Which is in 2019, way back in 2019, 30 years ago, it seems, right? In 2019, Zach, the federal budget was $4.5 trillion.
Yes.
Last year, it was $6.7 trillion. That is an increase of 50%.
Yeah, it's a lot.
50% increase over 5 years.
Yeah,
to your viewers, to our viewers, our listeners, ask yourself, can you point to some part of American life that is 50% better for all of that money? Because I'll tell you, Zach, if I tell you we were gonna eat at Cheesecake Factory and now we're gonna eat at Capitol Grill. Capitol Grill is about 50% more expensive than Cheesecake, and guess what? It shows. It shows in the service. It shows in the food. It shows in your cocktail of choice. I typically go Coke Double Ice Lime if you want to know the truth. But here's the fact that where is the evidence that money was well spent? And so I don't think it's crazy
but there's a huge
to roll
chunk of
back
it
the
is
clock.
Interest. That's a huge chunk of that is interest because of the amount of spending that we have. And the challenge becomes in that case with what Donald Trump is trying to present here, not in the DOGE dividend checks, but with his tax policies. He's talking about a reduction in revenue that if he implements everything he wants, that's almost $10 trillion over 10 years, $1 trillion a year. He's going to reduce our revenue by that much. Even if we cut spending by $2 trillion, we'd still have a deficit.
What tax policies are you referring to?
So extending the tax cuts, and I know off the top of my head exactly all these numbers. Tax cuts and Jobs Act extension is $4.5 trillion over 10 years. Social Security would be about $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Overtime would be $3.1 trillion over 10 years. And I think it was like $100 billion for tips. Tips is almost
let's just talk about overtime, for example. So what is that policy, Zach?
The policy would be there's no taxes on overtime pay.
Okay, who benefits from that?
I mean, it depends on who you like.
Well, not wealthy billionaire CEOs, right?
Here's the thing:
not wealthy billionaire CEOs, right?
You may be wrong about that because what happens in these circumstances when you simplify it to black and white, you go, will these people be saving money who are workers? On the surface, yes. However, when you give the incentive to people to not pay people to have overtime, that's all that's going to happen is employers are going to be less incentivized to have people work overtime. It's just not going to be a successful policy because they're going to want these folks to be working. Like if you're not getting taxed on overtime and you're an employee, you're going to want to work overtime as much as humanly possible. That is not beneficial to employers because overtime pay is usually time and a half. So employers have almost no incentive to continuously push people to play overtime in general. But then if they want to do it because they're going to make even more money on top of that time and a half, the odds that these companies are going to just pay hand over fist to pay these employees to go into overtime extraordinarily low. The likelihood is they'll get part-time employees to work instead of them, so they don't have to pay them time and a half. I mean, but
I think you're overthinking it.
I'm not overthinking it. I think you guys are underthinking it. That's the problem, is that on the surface, it's one of those things, again, where it's theoretically it makes sense. But then when you break it down into how is this functionally going to work, the dynamics of basic business are saying, well, that probably won't work very well. If people are more incentivized to try to work overtime, but it costs the employer more to have them do that, the employer is not going to want to do that. They'll change their strategy.
But the employee's incentive to work overtime has no effect on whether the employer offers overtime. Overtime is dependent on the business conditions in the moment.
Sure. But right now, if I'm so just hypothetically, if I'm a person who works overtime here,
well, how does it change for the business? Because the incentive structure changes for the taxpayer, for the worker.
Because the worker
no
will be
incentive or disincentive change for the business.
Correct. The only difference, like I'm saying, is if people are going to make even more money working overtime beyond the time and a half they're traditionally paid for overtime, they're going to want to do it more. They're going to push to work overtime more, and that's going to be bad for the business's bottom line.
Wait, okay, you skipped a step there. So they want more overtime, much like unions want a lot of things, and businesses, as you many a times have said, push back on those things. Mm-hmm. How do you go from people wanting to work overtime to it hurting their margins? There's a step there. What's there?
What do you mean? I'm saying that if an employer is now overwhelmed with overtime requests from people who want to continue to do it, they're going to go, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to hire more part-time employees to not have to pay you time and a half. That's it. I'm just saying the dynamics of these. If I'm a corporation and the people that I have working for me are incentivized financially to work overtime even more than they previously were, there's going to be a higher demand for that type of work, and I'm not going to want to pay it as an employer. That's the point.
Why wouldn't you want to pay it?
Because it's a time and a half
going up.
Yes, it is. No, that's the point. Overtime is usually time and a half.
Yeah, but the price of the overtime is no higher in this new tax regime,
but if the demand
than it was
higher
before.
So
Econ 101.
Demand to do it is
the
higher.
price of something has to change for the behavior around it to change. So
I understand.
You're claiming there's a change of behavior, Zach, with all due respect. You're claiming there's a behavioral change. So I'll give you an example. If people suddenly don't want to buy gas, why? Because gas is $10 a gallon. Okay, that makes sense, right? People don't want to buy gas. That's the effect. The cause was gas is more expensive. Yeah. You are saying there's an effect with these employers not wanting to offer overtime, but you haven't
don't want to offer
explained.
It's that you
haven't explained what is the cause of that.
I'm saying they won't want to offer more overtime because it's more costly for them. That's what I'm saying.
It's not. Why is it more costly than them? The tax structure didn't change.
I'm not saying it's from a tax perspective. I'm saying it from a payroll perspective. It's more expensive.
Why is it more expensive?
Overtime is more expensive than regular pay.
I know that.
That's all.
Why is there more? Well, hold on. Why is there more overtime work?
I'm saying I'm not saying there's more overtime work. I'm saying there'd be more demand for overtime work. And what employers will do is, instead of trying to meet that demand, they will just hire out part-time workers, and they'll probably do that even more so now. I'm just saying the point is
I don't know with the deportations. I don't know where all these part-time workers are going to come from. I also know that there's also a training element to it as well, right? So if you're,
what do you mean?
You're working in a specialized field, hiring someone off the street as a part-time worker just because you don't want to pay time and a half, as opposed to paying time and a half to the person, or saying I have to pay less to this person and I have to train them, which incurs costs and so on. Let's just leave it at that. I don't think it's that clear cut. I'll tell you that with this policy,
but it's also $3.1 trillion over 10 years in lost revenue. I mean, let's be honest about that.
So let's be honest, that money is going into the pockets of hardworking people in this country, and those cost estimates do not take into account the macroeconomic positive
but hold on. But based on what you just said, they're not going to be making any more. The only difference is they might be paying, tax on overtime, but it's not like they're incentivizing new work, like you just said. It's not going to be new work. It's just going to be saving the tax money, which I understand it, but that's an insane amount of money. That's $300 billion a year.
Yeah, but
that's a lot of money. But the point, you're missing the overall point. The overall point I'm making is Donald Trump is proposing massive revenue reductions for the government, and then at the same time saying, "Oh, we're going to save a ton of money and give it back to you." It doesn't add up. There's not enough to cut to get to a point where we're not in a massive deficit. He's increasing our deficit tremendously with these plans, and then saying, "Oh, don't worry, we're going to save money somehow." It doesn't make any sense. That's the issue that myself and the entire left has with this whole plan, is that on paper it sounds nice, but you have to cut really critical services for people if you really want to make a dent in spending here. There's just no question about it. You can't just go, find the waste, find the fraud, it'll all pay for itself. There is nowhere near enough waste to pay for all this stuff, especially if you're pretty much quadrupling our deficit if you don't come back and cut the right things.
You know, the line we've heard from Democratic leaders for the longest time has been Republicans want to cut taxes for billionaires and the wealthy. And then when President Trump wins, he actually goes out and cuts taxes, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime.
He hasn't done that yet. That's not even in the budget proposal.
But again, you're criticizing it as if he is going to do it. So let's take it on its face that he's going to do it. I think he absolutely will. President Trump is a man of his word.
It's a terrible
what's
idea.
going to end up happening What's going to end up happening is that is a benefit. So I don't know what is it, because do you guys ever want tax cuts for anybody? Do you ever want them, or do you ever support tax cuts?
I think it depends on the circumstances, right? I think, so let's look at the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, for example, okay? When you look at benefit by household, the reason the left says, oh, there's a tremendous, skew towards billionaires and people who are in the 1% is because when you look at the amount of money they save versus the amount of money an average family saves, the difference is extreme, obviously, because the difference in their income is extreme. But when you actually look at the aggregate benefit, about 80% of it goes to the upper 1%, and the rest of the 20% is distributed amongst everybody else. That's not a really effective tax cut if you're trying to sell it as, hey, the average American's going to save money. It's like when you look at on the surface, they'll save maybe $1,000 a year, which is fine. That's okay. But is that worth $4.5 trillion in deficit spending and to give the majority of the benefit to the upper 1%? No, it's not, because there's no actual proof that giving that amount of benefit to the upper 1% is beneficial to the economy. It's been pitched over and over and over and over again, and every meta-analysis shows it doesn't work. So to me, it's not a question of, do I want tax cuts? Of course I want taxes. I don't want to pay the amount that I pay.
Do you want lower taxes for companies that build in America?
Yes.
So you support that?
But even corporate taxes are only like $500 billion in revenue a year. It's a pretty small chunk of what our overall revenue structure is. The main revenue drivers are individual income taxes and Social Security and payroll taxes. But individual income taxes is the number one thing. And the majority, 4/5 of that benefit goes to the upper 1%. Do you think that's an equitable split?
4/5 of what?
4/5 of the benefit of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act goes to the upper 1%. And I understand it's a measurement based on their, dramatically higher income, and that's, an easier thing to do.
Well, but are these also, that's one way to frame it.
Yeah.
It's also true to frame it that 4/5 of it are going to the largest job creators in America.
Not necessarily. Right? No. Do you look at tons of these people are not job creators? It depends on who you're talking to. If you want to talk about job creators,
who is more of a job creator, the top 1% or the bottom 1%?
Well, that's the framing of that question is ridiculous. The top 1%.
Who's a bigger job creator, the top 1% or the bottom 10%?
But again, it's the same question, just subtly altered. It's not a question, like individuals are not.
Hold on, would you rather give tax cuts to people who are
jobs.
going to create jobs or who are never going to create jobs? If you just had a choice.
But here's the thing. That's again not the question. The question should be corporate taxes versus individual taxes, right? Because if we're going to talk about incentivizing people who actually create jobs, that's corporate taxes. That's not personal income taxes, right? So
that's what President Trump is doing with this plan to lower the corporate tax rate if you hire and
15%,
build in America,
right,
to 15%.
It's a 6%
That is a great
cut.
policy.
It's a 6% cut.
That is a great, but remember, these capital decisions about where to build a factory or where to hire, those decisions are made with margins that are far tighter than that 6% would suggest.
Sure, I'm not against that.
But remember, Zach, it's not. Let's not just think about it in the one-dimensional way of, well, there's going to be a hit to revenue, et cetera. Let's just play it through this way. Because of the cut from 21% to 15%, a factory is built that otherwise would not have been built in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. That factory employs 5,000 people.
Yep.
Half of those 5,000 people were on government benefits, like SNAP, like WIC, like Medicaid. They're no longer on those government benefits because they now have gainful employment, and good for them. So now what you've done is you've decreased the amount of government spending on their safety net. You've given them the dignity and purpose that comes with gainful employment. One person's spending is another person's income, another person's income is another person's spending, et cetera.
Yeah.
Now they're propping up the local economy. And you know from all the data, Zach, that when you have two parents in the household who are gainfully employed, those children are going to be much more successful in life, more
All right,
likely to
but
graduate,
way down the
more
road here.
likely.
Let's stay on the economy, right?
No. But what I'm saying
I
is
know there's a macro
I
effect. I
reject the
understand what you're saying.
one-dimensional thinking of the DC economists.
But this is a
Totally.
one-dimensional hypothetical. That's the issue that I have with it. Is like you're laying out this.
But
like,
hold on.
blue
There
sky
are
world.
benefits. There are benefits, Zach, of lowering tax rates
Yes.
for companies that build in America, that hire America, that are not captured by the statistics that
Correct,
you're saying,
but
right?
Here's the question.
Right.
I agree with you. I agree with that. But here is the
Right.
question: how many sets of circumstances are you going to have where that 6% savings is going to make a company completely alter their business plan and move their shit from overseas back
Not
to here?
Well, Apple just put $500 billion into the economy.
Well, pay the
Apple
labor. No, hold on. Let's just, because you're trying to get into context here. So let's get into the real context. If you're asking a business to make this massive shift, to move their labor force from overseas to here, to move their manufacturing from overseas to here, those are very expensive costs. 6% savings on their taxes likely won't be enough. They're still going to be in the red for that. There's very little incentive for these companies to do that unless there's a much larger tax benefit to them, which there just isn't going to be, because the rate was already 21%. It just goes down to 15. And frankly, these companies only pay 15 now anyway because of Joe Biden's act, where you mandate 15% payment, but they pretty much get it down to 15 no matter what. That's pretty much what we've seen. So in the end, you're not really seeing much of a reduction in what they actually end up paying. Sure, the rate might be 15 instead of 21 officially, but they all paid 15 anyway because that was the mandatory minimum. So to me, when you really break down the context, does your hypothetical sound good? Yes. Do I agree with it in theory? Yes. But in practice, it's not that simple, and it's not going to. It's just not. It's not. It's too simplified. It can happen, but does it? Is it intelligent? Is it the actual bottom line decision a company's going to make if they're already having a much better profit margin overseas? A 6% benefit's not going to make them change their entire model.
So you presume that they're going to change that opening a factory and hiring 5,000 Americans is changing a business's entire model. Apple still creates phones in Shenzhen, China, and yet they just announced last week they're investing $500 billion in the U.S. economy to build new plants, to build new manufacturing facilities here, and to hire Americans. So it's not a black or white. We're going to shut down all of our overseas operations.
Well, that's a huge asterisk.
We are going to shut down all of our operations and then move to the U.S. That is not the choice that most, or really any business, is facing.
All their Chinese operations.
Why do you think, Zach? Why do you think President Trump has been able to secure $2 trillion of new investments into the U.S. since he won? Why?
I think it's an unrelated question. I'm sure that the answer you want to hear is because we're incentivizing these people to invest in America, which I agree to a small degree is the truth. But you're focused on companies that are already in a position to pay for this stuff. I'm not focused on Apple. Apple is a multi-trillion-dollar company, the largest company in the world. They have hundreds of billions of dollars just sitting around in free cash. They can make that shift. It's not as big an issue for them. They can eat a bunch of the cost. Most companies can't. That's the reason I look at this and go,
what
I don't
company,
care.
Like what? Like which company?
I mean, I'm talking about like more niche companies that are not going to be like
what?
A brand. What are you talking about? Like what? Manufacturing companies, shoe companies. It doesn't matter. Like I'm not trying to be like ultra specific. I'm saying that your examples of the literal most successful company in the world doing it. I want to see mid-tier companies that work on steel. What are they going to do? Things like that. It's not as simple as like, oh, well, the biggest companies in the world have decided to go with President Trump on this, because of course they do. They have the financial movement ability to do that. But if they can't, these other companies don't have that level of maneuverability, so they're not going to be able to make these massive shifts like Apple can, because they have tons of wiggle room to do so. That's the difference. It's like when you get into the specifics, it's like, yeah, sure, of course Apple did that, because they're sitting on a pile of cash and they can create benefit. Like their investment in America is a long-term investment they can afford. Most companies can't afford that. They don't have the balance sheet to do it like Apple does. That's
why. Well, the challenge is, one, Apple didn't announce this in the past 4 years. That's rather telling, even though they had all that money. Again,
number
you're right. Two,
Trump's plan is better for them.
Trump's plan is better for I think it's better for everybody. I think Trump's plan is better for everybody. Can you name one person who's disadvantaged? Who's disadvantaged by this plan?
Who's disadvantaged by this plan? I mean, if this plan is fully implemented, we're going to have such a tremendous problem with our deficit that if you guys have been pissing and moaning about the deficit forever and saying, oh, it's going to destroy the families of, destroy the future of our children. There you go. That's who's at disadvantage. Pretty much everybody who cares about our interest becoming one of the largest expenditures for the the business of America. That's who's who stands to have a really difficult set of circumstances here. It's like it's nice on like all this stuff you're talking about sounds nice on paper, but you guys have not made it clear in any way, shape, or form how you're going to afford it. It's still, it all goes back to the original question of, do you believe, let's just assume that I'm correct about this cost over the next 10 years of $9.2 trillion. Do you really believe that growth can make up for that revenue shortfall? $9.2 trillion.
I'll tell you why. We're at 20. So I know you keep saying $9.5 trillion. I need to see a full breakdown of that, but let's just assume it's $9.5 trillion. Okay. If you have a $20 trillion economy, which we do, and that economy over 10 years grows by 15-20%, which is not crazy. That's actually a pretty conservative growth period. Not really. Okay. Yes, you absolutely can pay for this. But ultimately, Zach, the question you have to ask for is, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for the deficit and everything being balanced in 10 years? Or are you optimizing for Americans having good paying jobs, living healthy lives, not dying of overdose, not dying of chronic disease, having access to good health care, but also living in a healthy country to begin with? Because to tell you the truth, a lot of people on Medicaid are not well served by having just free healthcare. They are well served by having good, healthy options in their community. They're not well served by red number 40 and by
food options.
Yeah, healthy food options in their community. Right, that's the truth. 25% of SNAP food stamp dollars are spent on sugary drinks. Zach, no amount of increasing Medicaid spending is going to change that.
So what are you guys doing about it? You guys talk a big game about all this stuff. Healthcare is going to be great. What are you doing about it? You don't even have a plan for healthcare. You guys are looking to cut Medicaid and probably cut Medicare. Like you're cutting 50% of the people who process Social Security. What are you guys going to do to make those things better? Just giving Americans jobs is not going to do it. There's no plan. Well, the current system sucks.
Hold on. If you make more money, do you eat healthier? Yes or no?
It depends. If you're, because there's an addiction, 100%.
No, hold on. Seriously, food. If we took BMIs and household income and did a chart, are you really telling me that the more
a million of them?
Okay,
most of the people
we're talking
that I know who are
we're talking about the health. You guys argue that the health of people is linked to social determinants in their community. The food desert argument is literally based on the idea they don't have enough money, therefore they're subjected to eat inferior quality food, and that breeds chronic disease. Yes or no?
Accurate. Yes.
That is entirely connected to socioeconomic status. So yes,
100%.
The wealthier you are, and yes, there are outliers. George Lopez is one of them. Chris Christie is another. There are outliers.
There's a ton of rich people. A ton of them. I mean, it's America, but it's a very, very obese country. Let's not pretend like it's all just because of poor people. It's poor and wealthy. Yes, if you're wealthier, you're more likely to not be out of shape because you're more likely to have access.
That is what we're talking about.
But that doesn't make it like. But it's too black and white. There's a ton of wealthy.
You're more likely.
but it's not the question. The question is, what are you guys like? You're acting as if getting the economy moving and getting more jobs, not only going to pay for all this stuff, but somehow it's going to make life in America great when there are tons of things with the American system that suck. And the reason that Democrats want to balance the budget. I think if you went
to the average American and said, I can give you a pay raise, that's going to fix most of their problems.
It will not, because the problem, because people aren't in a bad set of circumstances because they need an extra $1,000 a year. Okay. That's really what you guys are pitching. You're pitching it like they're all going to be these super wealthy people. They're going to make a marginal amount more per year. It's not going to massively change their life. I mean, that's not true. Based on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the average American family will save about just under $1,000 a year. Not to say that's not a good amount of money. It's a good amount of money for the average American family, but it's not going to reshape their entire existence.
Well, that's predicated on that you're presuming that does not increase the incentive to work, which could, in some cases of some households, double, go from $50,000 to $100,000 because now
less
the
than
second
$100 a month
is incentivized to work.
You think the incentive to work is going to drastically change from saying, hey, you could make an extra $100 a month? It's crazy.
Wait, where did you get $100 a month from?
If they're making $1,000 a year in tax savings of the average American family, that's less than $100 a month. The benefit is not there. You're talking about it like this big incentivizer. That's not incentivizing amount. That's not incentivizing amount of money.
Wait, hold on.
At
If you
all.
make $40,000 a year on tips and you don't get taxed on those tips,
But that's specific to tipped
10
employees.
grand.
I'm
Hold on,
talking
that's
about
$10,000.
Okay, that's tipped employees. That's a totally different statement.
Okay, so now let's go to overtime. So you make $20,000 a year on overtime and you're not taxed on overtime. How much are you saving then, Zach?
Right, but that's again specific to
That's
people who get overtime.
$6,000
Majority
of
of people
income
do
that
not.
you wouldn't have.
The majority
You
of
keep talking
workers
about
are not tipped,
$100 a
and the
month.
majority of people are not working overtime.
What I'm talking about is $500 a month.
I'm talking
That's
about
real money.
I'm talking about all Americans at a macro level. You're talking about niche specifics because they fit your point. But in the end, most people are not.
Hospitality is not a.
Most people are not tipped.
Industry.
Most people do not get overtime. Basic.
How many people do?
I don't know how many people do, but I know it's not the majority. And
certainly not a
so
niche, is it?
I would like to have, if you want to talk about majority minority, the majority of people don't benefit from those things. So really, what they're getting is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act benefit.
The standard deduction being double of what it was under President Obama.
I didn't. I lost money on it because I could itemize deductions higher than 24,000 by far.
But hold on, Zach. We're not talking about you and me. We're talking about the average hardworking American.
Mm-hmm.
Does the doubling of the standard deduction benefit the average American family? Yes or no?
It depends. It depends on the family, what they do. Certain people, the average family, they could have a ton
average
of
family would be the one with the average median income. The average family, the median
but the income,
family,
but the way in which they make their income is what determines what they can deduct, right? So
how
I can't
do
tell
most
you.
people make their income, Zach?
I don't
W-2
know.
or 1099?
But even as a W-2 employee, you can deduct a ton
Hold
of
on.
stuff. And
Just
that's the thing about
how
Trump's
do-
tax code that was terrible is that back then, before Trump's tax code,
Trump's
as a
tax
W-2
code was so
employee,
terrible that
you had-
people voted for him in all 50 states. There was an increase
Let-
in
let-
pickup.
let me finish the
He won
point,
every
all right?
single county. He won every.
Look,
So
they
what
didn't.
happened?
People don't understand what Trump is pitching. All right, and in the end, that
I
tax
trust
code,
the American people that their lived
James,
experience, as you guys say, was a lot better under his leadership.
You talking over me is not making your point. Okay, the point that I'm trying to make is he had a destructive approach to a tax code where you have families that could have dramatically had a better set of circumstances as W-2 employees with deductions that would be way better than a 24,000 standard deduction. So this concept that it benefits the average person, you don't know that. It's not even close to something you could know because the specifics are what matter here, because deductions are based on the specifics of what you do, not how much you make or if you're average or not average. It's based on what is your employment. W-2, 1099, I don't care. It depended on the industry prior to Donald Trump. And then Trump erased all of those potential deductions and said, hey, here's a doubling of the standard deduction, but I'm going to screw you over in the back end, because that's what that plan was.
What deduction did you get rid of?
What are you talking about? Pretty much itemizing as a W-2 employee becomes essentially impossible at that point because he made the threshold way too high, and it's a completely botched system.
What would an average W-2 employee need to itemize?
What do you mean? Depends on what they do.
Oh, so give me an example of one.
Okay, so I'm a W-2. I was a W-2 employee. I work from home. I could deduct my mortgage. I could deduct a percentage of my mortgage because it's my home.
That seems like a tax gimmick. Why should you be able to do that?
Because it's my home office. That's the tax code.
But most people don't work from home. Most people have to go into
you
work
asked for an example. I gave you an example. I'm saying that
you gave me your example.
It's my life. It's something I can tell you.
I know you gave me your example, but most of our listeners don't have the privilege of working from
tons
home.
of people work from home, especially after the pandemic. Maybe not.
Literally not tons of people work from home. No. What percentage of Americans work from home, Zach?
I have no idea.
You think it's less than 50?
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's less than 40.
Probably. It's not the point.
Less than 30.
You still haven't answered the question.
I guess
how
the point
are
we're
you
trying
paying
to
for
get
this? How are you going to pay for this? And how are you going to? How is it going to benefit the average?
Well, I've
person?
answered the question. I
You
said
haven't.
We're going to grow the economy.
But here's the thing. Trump said that in 2017 when he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and in 18 and 19. I'm not even going to get into the pandemic. In 18 and 19, there was zero evidence that particular set of policies was beneficial to the economy. Zero. What's the evidence that showed it worked? GDP was flat. Nothing happened.
There was no There was no economic growth in 2018 or 19.
There was economic growth, but it was not like,
you said GDP was flat.
Flat. I mean, like the point 1 or 0.2.
Well, hold on, but you said there's no economic growth, and then there was, and then the GDP.
The difference
was flat.
between 2.5 and 2.8%. Congratulations, that's not enough. It's 0.3%.
Hold on. Was unemployment lower in 2019 than in 2017?
The difference was marginal.
Was black unemployment lower in 2019 or versus 2017?
Was the pace in which unemployment was dipping for the last 6 years prior to that already exactly where it landed because of Barack Obama? Yes. Did Donald Trump do anything to specifically affect that change? No. Point to it if he did, because it doesn't exist. If you look at the trend line from right when Obama recovered the economy in 2012 down to where Donald Trump praises his unemployment rate, the rate does not change. It actually slows down a bit under Donald Trump. So it's a ridiculous statement. Like, yes, you have this piece of data that in a silo looks good. But if you zoom out and look at the prior 10 years and the person who implemented the plans that Donald Trump inherited, it was going down the entire time at the same exact pace. Trump didn't accelerate anything when it comes to unemployment.
So how is the unemployment rate measured?
What do you mean?
Well, because it's again one of those one-dimensional measurements, because what you're not accounting for is the increase in labor force participation that happened under President Trump. There were more people working, not just the unemployment, but more people who were now looking for work, who were getting work. Remember, unemployment only measures, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, unemployment, you're only considered unemployed in America if you've been looking for work in the past
I know the metric.
weeks. But I think most people don't. I think most people don't, Zach.
Well,
I just want to restate
cares?
that. The unemployment rate only counts you as unemployed if you've been looking for work in the past 4 weeks.
Correct.
So if you're someone with a criminal background, one, I don't think you should be discriminated against for work. If you are someone of a particular group, I don't think you should be discriminated against for work. What we saw under Trump's first term is people who were of a certain ethnic background, racial background, as well as those with criminal convictions, were now welcomed back into the labor force. We saw some of the tightest labor markets. And again, don't take my word for it. You had Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve comment how tight labor markets had gotten in 28 and 2019. Now, I'm glad that you stopped your analysis at 2020, because that's when the China virus happened. And we're never going to forgive China for that. It absolutely came from a lab. You and I can have that debate another day. But I guess the point, Zach, is that we didn't have the fullness of time to really see what the effects were. But if you want to judge Trump's first,
but here's the thing. I'm looking at the numbers
President
right
Trump's
now.
first tax cuts, those first 2 years actually were quite successful.
They were not.
And demonstrably better than they would have been under President Obama's trend line.
No, so here that's incorrect. So in 2018, which is when they went into effect, that first year was a 2.97 GDP, right? 2019 lost 0.5, 2.47. So there's GDP loss in the first after the first 2 years of this, he lost GDP growth. So how is that beneficial? How does his plan work? That's prior to the pandemic.
And what did unemployment do?
It went down marginally at the same trend line that it was going down.
What were the numbers?
Let me see. Let's see. All right, it was pretty much right when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act went into effect. It was 4%, and then right before the pandemic, it was 3.6%. Went down by 0.4%. It was in the exact same.
How many people?
Who cares? That's not the point. We're talking about the trend line. Who cares about the amount of people?
You're talking about all these.
You're trying to reframe it. No, it's not abstract.
Answer.
You're trying to reframe it because the numbers are bad. That's as simple as it gets. Donald Trump's numbers were dog
going
shit.
Down.
These were bad numbers.
Going down by half is a bad thing. How?
Going down by half? What are you talking about?
How many people is that, Zach?
Who cares how many people it is?
1.7 million people had jobs.
I'm staring at the trend line right now.
1.7 million people.
It's 0.4%.
Jobs.
Congratulations, Don. You got 0.4% down while GDP lost.
No, hold on. You keep saying 0.4 because you think it benefits you, and I'm talking about 1.7 million hardworking people, whether they were black or white. You don't care that they got a job.
It's not a relevant analysis of Donald Trump's economic approach.
1.7 million people.
Look at the trend line.
1.7 million people.
It's like this. It's a slope.
You're talking about Americans like trend lines on a regression analysis.
If you want to assess the economy, you need to look at it at these effects, okay? And if you're telling me that the pitch that you're making for Trump's plans is that this $9.2 trillion is going to get paid for by economic growth, the 2 years where he was not sullied by the pandemic, he did the opposite with the plan he's going to extend. That is why I don't understand what you're saying. It all sounds nice when you try to reframe and go, how many people is that? Who cares? It's not a macro effect that's going to pay for the amount of stuff that's going to force a ton of drastic cuts. And you haven't given a single substantial answer with any kind of data as to how it's actually going to work. You just say, oh, it sounds nice and it might work. There's no specifics. $9.2 trillion over 10 years needs to be recouped, or this is going to be a disastrous budget situation. Our interest will be way over $1 trillion. How do you pay for it? You haven't answered it.
So
growth won't
have
do
answered it.
You haven't, because growth in those 2 years didn't grow. So how do you pay for it? Where is the growth? Where is this magic growth you're talking about? It's theoretical. It's not seen in data or practice. Show me where it is. Point me to the data. I'd love to see it. It doesn't exist. You can't. That's the problem. It's so frustrating because it's like, yes, you can cherry pick little things, but when you look at the macro effect of the economy, Donald Trump was not like amazingly successful, and most metrics were flat. So show me, where is your evidence that this is going to work? It doesn't exist.
So I just want to be clear here. You are arguing that because in over a 2-year period, Donald Trump added 1.7 million jobs to the economy, gave those people now income, allowed them to contribute to the economy, to spend and to grow GDP, that somehow that
lost
means
GDP went down. GDP went down from 2018 to 2019 by 0.5%. So it didn't grow GDP.
So 1.7 million people got jobs over that period. But I guess my point is, again, you can prioritize which metric you want.
But you're pitching growth.
You're
pitching economic growth as the way that this is going to get paid. That's why I'm focused on it.
I just want to be clear here. You are making a prediction about what's going to happen over the next 10 years based on what happened over a 2-year period 7 years ago, in which actually economic growth was pretty solid and joblessness went down and jobs went up. And you are continuing to not incorporate the massive effects of AI, of autonomous driving, of the energy transition, et cetera, et cetera.
Look, if you could point me to anything that shows that those things are going to be enough to make up for these massive shifts that you're presenting from an economic perspective, show me. But these are all theory. It's theoretical. And in the end, what's going to happen
AI is definitely not theoretical.
What does AI have to do with this? It has nothing to do with
I think that AI has a lot to do with the economy growing faster than it otherwise would.
I'm asking what Donald Trump's plans, how they're going to grow.
So I'm answering your question because I'm saying that the ability to pay for these plans rests on economic growth. Correct. That economic growth is going to be faster than it was over the past 10 years because of technologies like artificial intelligence. Why? I'll make it very simple for you. Companies that are able to cut labor, replace it with software, are able to increase profits, which are paid into tax receipts.
I thought you cared about jobs. I thought all these people are losing jobs then. You're weaving back and forth. When it's convenient, people lose jobs. When it's inconvenient, they gain jobs. Which is it?
So again, you're talking about job loss from one industry to another.
People can't just change jobs. It's not that easy. You can't just become a coal miner tomorrow if you've been a graphic designer forever. That's not how it works.
Well, of course it's not how it works. And that's why there is a structural nature oftentimes to unemployment. I guess my point is that at the end of the day, the Luddites were concerned about, well, we don't want these jobs to go away. We want to hold ourselves back into the dark ages so we can keep these jobs. That's not how the economy works. There's going to need to be relocation. There's going to need to be a retooling of skills, a retraining. For the longest time, Democratic leaders have told coal miners to learn to code. Now the coal miners are going to tell the coders, it's time to roll up your sleeves, get down in the mine, become a plumber, become an electrician, do something with your hands. Or by the way, you can join leisure hospitality, which is also largely insulated from AI.
So what do those people do?
No tax on tips, no tax on overtime.
Okay, so let's just hypothetically play this out. If that's the road the hill you want to die on here, let's say I'm a graphic designer and I want to shift.
Well, it's not a hill; it's a cave, actually.
Okay. Let's say I'm a graphic designer and I want to do exactly what you're saying, right? I want to go out there and I want to shift my career. You got to go through training. You're not going to make very much money with it. It's going to be what is going to cover that shortfall for millions and millions of people.
There are not millions of graphic designers in the country.
No, you know what I mean? Like people who are shifting out of careers that the AI can replace.
They can go be a bartender. That doesn't take a lot of training.
It does take training, actually.
They can go be a hostess. I just don't.
Look, but the money you make is dramatically less. Like it's not thinking about it enough. It's just like you're saying, like, well, it's essentially you're kicking the can down and go, we'll figure it out. How? Like I'm just not hearing an answer as to how.
Well, look, there have been plenty of technological shifts over time, and people have just figured it out. And so I'm going to trust the resilience of workers to be able to do that. The truth is that there are going to be fewer graphic designers 10 years from now than there are today. There are going to be fewer software engineers than there are 10 years from now than there are today.
Yeah.
And those people are going to have to adapt. And it's precisely because, Zach, there will be fewer of them that the economy will be substantially larger, because AI is going to fuel this next chapter of growth. And so, look, we can talk ourselves blue in the face, but at the end of the day, my answer to your question will have to be answered empirically. I don't think there's anything I can say to you right here, right now, that's going to prove your point. You're very dug in with respect in this view that Donald Trump is not going to be able to deliver economic growth. I
didn't say that.
Will.
I didn't say enough economic growth to pay for what he's putting out there.
Well, okay, fine. I think he will deliver enough economic growth. Remember, he hasn't even been on the job 2 months, and there's been $2 trillion of new investment in America. That is a very powerful first date for what the next 4 years, and I think actually if JD gets in there, let's call it the next 12 years of what is going to happen for the country. But to tell you the truth, I think there's some points in these discussions where you have to just kind of roll up your sleeves and say, that's enough, right? There's nothing, Zach, I don't think there's anything, correct me if I'm wrong, I could tell you right now that is going to prove to you you've shot down AI, you've shot down the growth picture, you've continued to look into the selective picking of data.
Can I explain why? It's because when my side, right, we have the analysis of how much this stuff will cost, right? We have the numbers, we can lay out the numbers and how we get those numbers. Your side does not have the numbers to do the exact same thing to show how it will get paid for. That's the difference. That's the reason why I'm dug in, is because I'm providing you numbers that are substantiated by experts.
Do those numbers account for the economic growth that's going to be increased through the incentivizing of work?
The numbers I'm providing you are not saying that this is where we're
the numbers you're providing me are very one-dimensional.
No, the numbers are the cost.
Therefore, they're inaccurate.
That's an inaccurate assessment. I'm not saying that we're going to be in the whole $9.2 trillion. I'm saying that's the amount that this product costs. You have to tell me what you're going to do to earn that amount of money to balance it out. You can't. I'm just showing you the price tag. You're not offering me a plan to pay for it. That's why I'm dug in. If you said to me, hey, here's a paper that shows how we can make more than $9.2 trillion in economic growth over the next 10 years, and it's going to be great, and here's exactly how it's going to happen, I would go, look, that's awesome. Then I would be on board.
So just for context, there is $20 trillion of GDP every year, which is $200 trillion over 10 years. Mm-hmm. And you are talking about $9 trillion over 200. That's your denominator, Zach, is $200 trillion of economic output as measured through GDP.
But that's
and
not
you're talking
what I'm
about
measuring
$9 trillion.
I'm not measuring
You're talking about
GDP.
$9 trillion, and there's $200 trillion of growth.
I'm not measuring it through GDP. That's the question. I'm measuring it through how much
I'm answering your question
and
through
revenue.
GDP.
I understand, but GDP historically has not done that. It's not made up that level of shortfall.
GDP is pretty well correlated with revenue. GDP is pretty well correlated with revenue. Why, Zach?
I understand that GDP is well correlated with revenue. What I'm saying is that if the way in which my numbers are analyzed, this is not about GDP. It's about the amount of revenue we make. The actual amount, which is what, 4.7 trillion, whatever the hell it was last year. That's the metric. And I'm saying, okay, how are we going to lose a lot of that and dip down probably under $3 trillion over a certain point if we continue to go down this road? How are we going to make up for that when our expenditures are going to continue to be high? Yes, DOGE is trying to cut. You're not going to cut from $6.7 trillion down to 3. You'd cut and say it's so many things. Social Security, Medicare, you'd have to cut crazy stuff. That's where the numbers just don't add up for me. You can say economic growth till you're blue in the face, but it doesn't change the balance sheet of the government. And the government is looking at this and going, we only make X amount. You're going to make us make way less, and we still have to spend way more than you can cut. That's the problem. And there's not a sufficient answer as to how you're going to solve that problem. GDP growth does not solve that problem.
Well, no, it does. It's just a question of how much GDP growth is necessary to solve that problem. Well, because the more the economy is growing, the more people are working, the more they're earning, and the more they're paying in taxes. Taxes are a fixed percentage of your annual income. So the more folks are working, it's about 9 points.
But there's other ways to tax this. There's other structures that can work that have been shot down by Republicans over and over and over again.
Like what?
Taxing tax shelters for the billionaires, right? That's where most of their money lives anyway. Income taxes and billionaires is essentially irrelevant.
How much does that raise?
A ton. Elizabeth Warren proposed it a couple trillions, trillions over decades, but trillions. Even just taxing
like 1
Wall
trillion
Street
or
transactions.
7?
I don't remember the number. Elizabeth Warren had a really interesting proposal that I liked a lot, but because it was like essentially a 0.01% tax on Wall Street transactions, and the number that it was going to put out was extreme. So that's the kind of stuff where it's like, if you can go after places like that, you don't have to go after income tax. There's smarter ways to do this, and that's where I get frustrated. We can do what you're trying to do. You guys just aren't doing it right. Like, there are ways to make this work. Just slashing a bunch of stuff and pretending it's waste and saying that there's trillions of dollars in waste out there, when the real problem we have is the amount of debt that we have, because that creates the insane interest payment that we have every single year. That's about to eclipse $1 trillion a year. That doesn't go away with GDP. That is still going to be a problem if your revenues are too low and your outlays are too high. That's the issue. And if you can't start paying down our $37 trillion in debt, that's just going to keep going up. And eventually, when my daughter is 18, we're spending $2-3 trillion in interest payments every year. It's not tenable. That's the problem.
I don't disagree with you that that picture isn't tenable, and it's a shame that President Biden put us in a position where we had these multi-trillion-dollar deficits.
You can't completely lay the blame on Joe Biden.
Of
and
course,
Joe Biden had nothing to do with inflation.
He had nothing to do with multi-trillion. He came into office, there was $30 trillion of debt. He left, there was 36 and a half. Yeah, he had everything to do with it. Inflation
was a global inflation event. It was not just Joe Biden.
$30 trillion of debt to $36.5 trillion. Whose fault would that have been?
It depends. Well, a lot of it was
that was from President Biden's first day to his last day.
Yeah, I understand, but a lot of that stuff is Joe Biden just inheriting it. If you want to talk about the American Rescue Plan, it's what, $2.1 trillion. So there you go, 33% of it you can attribute to that.
Agreed. And again, separate debate. I think that plan was completely egregious, horribly timed.
Oh, we could debate that. That's fine. That one we probably find more.
The Infrastructure and Jobs Act. We can go into the Green New Scam, et cetera, et cetera. I think that at the end of the day, we're in a position where we have to look at not just, yes, cutting waste, but how do we actually grow the economy? If you want to become wealthier, you can't become wealthier by cutting your expenses down. You have to cut, but you also have to grow your income. The income of the country is GDP. It is tax receipts. It is the income of every single American that adds up to what the total labor costs are. And so that's how I think we get there. And it's just going to be a question of time, Zach.
But the problem is the way in which we pay for these programs is not GDP related. It's how we get revenue from taxpayers.
Yeah, but those things are, I am using GDP because you're talking about economic growth. You're talking about growing out of these things. I'm talking about
affording a program that costs $9.2 trillion. That's what I'm talking about. There has not been a sufficient answer as to how that will be paid for outside of GDP, but GDP is not going to affect enough to do this, because what we need to consistently have is enough cash to pay for our programs, and you guys can't feasibly cut that amount of money from programs without essentially eliminating some of the most popular programs in America. That's where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've certainly talked yourself into your position. There's no question about that.
It's not a talking myself in my position. That is the truth. You don't have a rebuttal to it because it doesn't exist.
What am I rebutting again?
What do you mean? What are you rebutting again? The fact that if you try to reduce revenue for the federal government, like an insane amount of money, but we don't reduce enough of our spending because DOGE can't cut Social Security. That's the biggest expenditure we have. There's things they just can't go in and cut. They can't.
There's fraud in there. We're going to cut that.
Yeah, but the Inspector General's report shows only 2% of these folks that are over like 100 or whatever. It's not wrong. There's no evidence of it. Even DOGE's own accounting, they say, well, we saved $55 billion. When you actually go into it, they only save 16. So they're rife with errors. They're putting things like, oh, there's $8 billion saved here. It's actually $8 million, and they counted it 3 times. This is the group I'm supposed to rely on? Give me a break.
So our proposal relies on an independent third party calculating those savings.
I'm not criticizing your proposal. I'm criticizing DOGE specifically.
Well, look, I think if you move as quickly as any organization has, DOGE is the Manhattan Project of our time. They did not exist 3 months ago. There are going to be errors. But Zach, the very fact that they corrected those errors and that you and I are even aware of them,
They didn't
They
correct
didn't
them.
correct the errors. They didn't
No.
update their website.
No, they actually
absolutely did.
They didn't.
They
actually
absolutely did.
They increased it from
absolutely
55
did.
to 65 billion when they was shown that they lost money. I don't know how
The,
you don't know
the
that.
individual line items that you're referring to were updated on the website.
But the total
They
wasn't.
absolutely
But
are.
the total was not updated. The individual line items were updated, but the total was not. Look it up.
Okay.
It's true.
I will have to look that up. But
It
what I'm
is
saying is the very fact that they are out here saying, look, we made a typo. And what has Elon said is he said, when you're moving as fast as we are, there are going to be small mistakes.
What's the
fact that we
here's a
know
question
that
about
those
that, too.
mistakes are happening?
What's the point of moving this fast when you're going to be you could move a little
For the
slower
same
and
reason,
make fewer mistakes?
for the same reason we have $1 trillion in interest expense. Same reason we have $36.5 trillion in federal debt. You have to move this fast because the situation is untenable and insolvency is around the corner. That's why you have to move this
Insolvency
fast.
is
Because of the urgency
nowhere
of the
near around the
situation.
corner. That's not accurate at all.
Wait, hold on. How are you arguing that if
mean,
you're saying we're going to lose all this money
define
and we have all
around
this
the
debt?
corner. Around the corner was next week. That's the
it's
point.
around the corner. It's
okay,
in the next couple of years.
But you don't need to be so egregiously just undisciplined compared to what you could actually be doing. If they just took a second, and
what would
just
you
thought
rather him
about-
do?
Take a little more time to think about more articulately what he wants to do with his cuts. Not fire a bunch of people like people who observed nuclear warheads in this country that are necessary. Whoops, let's rehire them. We've fired and rehired a hell of a lot of important people in this government because they just go, just cut them. It's a dumb approach. Look, if you want to cut the federal government workforce, it's a different debate. The way in which you make massive cuts in a pretty much the largest employer in the country is not just go, we'll make mistakes, we'll correct them, it's fine. It's like, how about trying a system where you don't have egregious amounts of mistakes right out of the gate? Seems reasonable. I'm not saying slow it down to a snail's pace. I'm just saying maybe don't just like toss a bunch of people out a window and hope they didn't break their spine and drag them back upstairs when you need them.
Zach, always a pleasure. We're running up against the 1.5 hour here.
Yeah.
And closing thoughts.
I think we're very far off from each other on this stuff because, as much as I want to keep it civil, you guys live in a fantasy land with this stuff, man. I really believe that. I believe that the right is kind of in fantasy land here where they're pitching very expensive ideas with no plan to pay for them. And, I hoped coming into this conversation, I would get more specifics on how it would be paid for, how we get to your DOGE dividend, all that stuff. I didn't get anything. And that's not surprising necessarily because I don't think your side has a concrete plan. And that's very dangerous for this country because it's going to become a big problem for a lot of people who are just voting for Trump because they wanted some extra money in their pocket. And maybe they'll get that little bit of extra money, but they're going to have an infrastructure around them that is dramatically worse than it is right now. That's my concern. I don't have this perspective because I want to hate on the right or anything like that. It's because I truly look at the circumstances and go, I don't see the information adding up. And if I did, I would support you guys. If you guys had a plan of going, how I'm going to pay for this, is how I'm going to pay for it, this is how I'm going to provide this, great. I'd be into it if it works, but it doesn't exist. And that to me is the most frustrating part of this. And unfortunately, there are millions of people in this country who are relying on you guys, believing your rhetoric. And they're going to be sitting there with their hands held out to you in 2026 and 2028 going, where's my shit? And you're going to go, whoops, couldn't do it. And you guys are going to get shellacked. So in the end, you guys are putting out some big promises that you better deliver on or you are going to get wrecked in the next 2 election cycles. And I think that's true. I think you don't know that it's true that it's not going to work, but I think that's what's on the line for your party. You've made huge promises. If you don't pay these out, you're screwed.
In an hour and a half, what I'm grateful for that you didn't do, and because you couldn't do it, is you didn't argue that the tax cuts that President Trump has on the table right now are uniquely benefiting wealthy Americans. They benefit everyone.
No,
they benefit everyone.
I did make that
He's
argument. I gave you the
delivering
data.
tax cuts for working Americans, whether they're in
80%
leisure,
goes to the top
hospitality,
1%.
whether they work overtime. Everyone's going to see a tax cut. And so I was appreciative that you didn't use that talking point because you could not use that
I used the
talking
data.
point.
80%
Because
of it goes to
no
the upper
tax on
1%.
tips. Billionaires don't own tips. Do not make tips. That is a tax cut for working people. Again, Kamala Harris loved this so much, she plagiarized Donald Trump just days later. And so I'm glad to see that the Democratic Party has lost a talking point. Again, always a wrong talking point.
I used the talking
that there
point.
wasn't a plan to actually
And I gave
deliver
you the
tax
data.
cuts for working people.
I mean,
Tax cuts for working people. That's a good thing, Zach.
Did I not give you the data that 80% of it goes to the top?
So
1%?
there aren't tax. There's no tax on tips.
Not yet.
That doesn't. Who does that benefit? Wealthy people or
He
working
hasn't
people?
passed that yet. It's not even in the budget proposal. So
He's
it's
passed nothing. He's passed nothing.
that's what I'm saying. So you're acting as if it exists. It doesn't even exist yet.
I'm talking about a plan that is on the table right now. That's what we're talking about. Nothing has been passed. So that's a totally moot point. My point is,
they won't be able to pass it because Republicans won't vote for it. There are certain
Republicans won't vote for no tax on tips and no tax on overtime.
They might vote for no tax on tips, not overtime or Social Security. 100%. It's too expensive. And that's the whole reason. Look at Massey. Massey came out and was like, there's no way I can even support this stuff because it's just like voodoo nonsense.
There's nothing voodoo about taking hardworking Americans and giving them more pay, whether it's on the Social Security checks
I'm not against that.
or on their leisure. That's what this is. I mean, that's what you're giving them more pay.
Look, yeah, pay for it. How do you pay for it?
Zach, always a pleasure, man.
It was a pleasure.
Talk soon.
Yeah.